The war on terror is over. The war on terror is over. What does that mean? Or the forever wars are over. What does that actually mean? I served on my most recent deployment in 2021 to East Africa, in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is one of those Islamist terrorist groups that follows the same ideology as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, and others. Qaeda, 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 ISIS, Hamas, and others. This group has been allowed to grow and be strengthened, even though they are one of the main groups that provides funding to Al-Qaeda in that entire region. Allowed to grow and be strengthened, even though they are one of the main groups that provides funding to Al-Qaeda in that entire region. Allowed to grow and be strengthened, even though they are one of the main groups that provides funding to Al-Qaeda in that entire region. So any president or politician can declare a war to be over, but when you have an enemy like these Islamist terrorist groups, who are still intent on their goal and their objective, which is to ultimately establish their Islamic caliphate and, destroy Israel and exterminate the Jewish people and basically kill or convert anyone who doesn't adhere to their ideology. That continues on, and they will only become stronger the longer our leaders put their heads in the sand and pretend like, oh no, this doesn't exist. This kind of war, this war specifically, is one that has to be waged militarily and ideologically. This war specifically, is one that has to be waged militarily and ideologically. And the ideological component to this, which is defeating their ideology with a superior one, is one that I pointed out in Congress during the Obama administration. The collective we were failing at. The Obama administration was failing at because they were so afraid of being labeled Islamophobes that they refused to accurately identify the ideology driving these terrorist groups and instead said, we are countering violent extremism, was the term that the Obama administration started to use and was coined and kind of mandated across the US government. Well, you have to know the enemy that threatens you and why they're doing what they're doing if you have any hope of actually preventing their attack.
So let me give some examples of how the security establishment works and why deep-seated racism is what drives these policies. So if you look at the FBI's entrapment policy, right, the FBI sends agents provocateurs into Muslim communities to entrap vulnerable people with things like, giving them cash to set up these plots. And of course, immediately after they set it up, they nab them. What's the logic here? The logic is that all Muslims are potential terrorists, and therefore we should nab them before they do anything, right? You look at Obama's counter-radicalization program, the CVE program, and it's about trying to recruit people from the Muslim community, imams, school teachers, coaches, and so on, to spy on their own community. Again, the idea is that there are people in the Muslim community that we should nab before they do anything. Same with the ubiquitous surveillance program, right? Now, there are some people who would say, oh, that's just smart security policy. But if the shoe were on the other foot, I think there'd be howls of anger. Take, for instance, Michael Wade Page, Dylan Roof. These are people who've committed hate crimes. But there's no corresponding, program with the FBI or local police departments to go into white communities and spy on them because they can produce people like this, right? There is no program to entrap them before they do anything.
Both militarily and as we're seeing now with Hamas's actions, not only directly in the assault on Israel, but how Hamas achieved their objectives in spreading their ideology around the world.
If you look at the lessons learned from the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, how do you fight terrorism?
Clearly understanding who they are and where they are and why they're doing what they're doing is essential, first of all. And obviously there are different groups, different names. They have morphed and changed based on their locale and how they operate. Building relationships with people in other countries, both state leaders as well as religious leaders and others who share that same objective of defeating these Islamist terrorists on both fronts, and acting as a united front in taking that action. What exactly that action looks like, details on the ground dictate that. Details about these different groups will dictate that. But we've seen examples of this before, and I saw this in Somalia. We saw it in some cases in Iraq, where, for example, you have imams who recognize the threat that these terrorist groups pose to their own people and their own communities, and exerting their influence in defeating that the terrorist Islamist ideology with their own teachings of Islam and preaching peace amongst their people. I saw this in Somalia. We saw it in some cases in Iraq, where, for example, you have imams who recognize the threat that these terrorist groups pose to their own people and their own communities, and exerting their influence in defeating that the terrorist Islamist ideology with their own teachings of Islam and preaching peace amongst their people. War is ugly and it is messy. It is also an unfortunate reality of the world we live in. So while I firmly believe that we must always pursue peace, I'm not a pacifist. I'm a realist, and recognize that where there are these threats, we must do what we can. Where there are these threats, we must do what we can.